And I kind of told Jeff, it's kind of ironic that happened because up until that point, if I had thought that if I were called to stand this morning, that basically I would preach a rerun of that same message, however. And this, Esther, you know this is kind of scary because from that time till now, God said that's not really what I want you to talk about this morning. So turn, if you will, to the 51st chapter of the book of Psalms. And some of you are probably going to hear a message similar to what you heard if you were at the conference back in October. I thought when these things were on my mind this morning, I thought, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of strange to preach the same message that close together. And the thought is, well, people already heard that. They don't really care about hearing it again. This is kind of a secular thing, but I'll tell you something that happened back about, I don't remember what year it was, 70, 71, 72, somewhere through there. Most of you all in here can probably remember a group called Three Dog Night. Yes or no? Yes. Okay, along about that time, they came out with a song about Jeremiah being a bullfrog. And one of our neighbors bought that record. I couldn't afford it myself. But me and a friend of mine went up and borrowed that record from them, and we ran the needle through that record. Over and over again, listening to Jeremiah was a bullfrog. So if we can tolerate, I guess, that much of that, we shouldn't be all that perturbed by hearing the same message, or at least the same type of message, of course. And this is what came on my heart very strongly. The 51st Psalm. And we're going to start reading at the 6th verse. This is at a point in time most of us know and can agree that David is writing this after he has transgressed. And he is speaking in this, actually almost the entire book of Psalm, in one way or another, is prayer. And what David is doing here, he is praying to the Father. So we know that he's talking to God. He says, "Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide thy face from my sins, and blot out all mine iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me." We're going to dwell on this 12th verse. "Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit." Now we're going to stop with the reading there, but if you would, just mark that passage in your Bible, because I feel like we'll probably turn back over to it in just a little bit. But again, we're going to emphasize, I think, that 12th verse, restore, by the fact that he is asking God to restore something. That would lead us, the believer, to know that it's something that he had at one time, and now he's lost it, and he's wanting to be restored. Now, I want you to notice something. This does not imply, I have never sat in judgment of anyone. But to me, in this particular passage, this does not tell me that David lost his salvation, because he's not saying, "Restore to me thy salvation," but he's saying, "Restore to me the joy of thy salvation." How many churches have we gone into, and I know that Estel can attest to this, I know that Brother Clifford could attest to this. We have gone into so many churches, and over the last few or several, however you want to put it, it seems like people's joy is missing. And what David, and I would like for you to acknowledge and to recognize this also, David in this passage is recognizing and acknowledging three very critical things. He acknowledges the fact that he, David, has fallen. Hear me, church. Has fallen or is falling out of fellowship with God. He has fallen or is falling into a state that we will label as spiritual darkness. The second thing, he is realizing that salvation truly is God's. God gave me a portion of it. God gave me part of it, enough to carry me through to glory on the other side. But salvation belongs to God. Can you amen that? And the third thing he realizes is that he cannot, and this is the state or condition that I think a lot of church members are getting into. They fail to recognize the fact, and David recognizes that he cannot, through his own ability or through his own strength or by any means that he has, he cannot possibly restore the joy of his salvation. The only one that can do that is God. Now, looking around, we all know about David's affair with Bathsheba. And we know how the adultery that he committed led him down a slippery slope, as it were. Now remember David at one time, remember David, the little shepherd boy that was so bold in the Spirit of God that he took a shepherd's sling and one little rock and brought down a giant that was taunting the armies of the almighty living God. And David, a scrawny little shepherd boy, took nothing but something that he knew how to use, his shepherd's sling, and one little stone, and he brought down the giant. So David is even referred to as a man after God's own heart. But David, when he committed this transgression with Bathsheba, not only was the crime or the sin or the transgression of adultery something that was accounted to him, but it led him into deceit. I'm not going to go to great lengths into that, but you know how that he called the wife of the woman that he had taken, and ultimately had him brought back to the king's palace and all this, supposedly to give a report on how the battle was going, but in reality, David had an ulterior motive and he was practicing deceit. When that deceit didn't work, it even led to David committing murder. And some people say, no, I take offense at that. David didn't commit murder. Oh yes, he did. David was not the one that thrust the sword or drew the bow or whatever instrument was used to end Uriah's life. But David, by the letter that he sent by Uriah's hand to the captain of the army, David, just as sure as I'm standing here, David was the man that killed Uriah. And later on in the passage where we read about all this, God sent a prophet and told David just exactly what he had done. Now, we all know about these fleshly sins. Everybody does. Adultery, drunkenness, gambling, blasphemy, and all these things. And I'll be honest with you, I can look around this congregation and I don't really think that for the most part of us, I don't really think anyone in here struggles a great deal with those. I'll just be honest with you. So what I want to caution us on this morning, and I hope you can accept this message in the spirit in which it is being delivered. Okay? I am not here to cast any stones. I'm not here to throw any rocks. But I am simply here to do this to encourage someone who might, at this point in their lives, be slipping into a state of spiritual darkness. I want to point you back toward the light. And again, I don't think that the majority of us are prone to any of these things. But we have a human-born, inborn tendency to drift away into these little sins of the Spirit. And when we start to, I guess just to kind of name a few of them, just unkind or thoughtless to one another, or harsh with one another, and so forth. And these, while they are not big in themselves, they are the, according to the way that Solomon puts it, they are the little foxes that spoil the vine. And these are behavioral sins. I want you to know something. I heard a phrase a long time ago, and I spoke this phrase in a church service, and somebody said, "Well, you must be a pretty smart man." I said, "Well, I've never been accused of that before." And they said to come up with such a saying as this, but the saying I heard was this, and beloved, I want you to hold on to this with all of your might. There was an old hillbilly preacher one time that made a statement to me when he said, "You be careful of your life." The Scripture puts it in this way, guard your heart. But he said, you watch the way you live and watch the way you treat others, because you are the only Bible that a lot of your neighbors, that a lot of your friends, you're the only Bible they're ever going to read. I may have told you this story one time. We were at work one day and sitting around the big humongous drafting table and having lunch. And one of the guys that I worked with said, "Ernie," said, "I know you're a preacher." He said, "Where do you do most of your preaching at?" And without a second thought, I said, "Right here." He said, "I've never heard you preach." I said, "No, but I hope that you have seen me preach by my daily life. If I'm not preaching by my life that I'm living, then I'm wasting my time up here below there, and that's just the way it is." But the phrase that I heard was, your talk talks, and your walk talks. But your walk talks louder than your talk talks. In other words, beloved, people are going to pay more attention to what you do than to what you say. The illustration of that, I read a story some time back about a woman that was, as most of us do, left for an appointment. She's running a little bit late. I know, Brother Clifford, you all have already heard this, but some of them haven't. But she left for an appointment. She was running a little bit late. And she was following a car, and she came up to a traffic light. And just as she was approaching it, the light turned yellow. Now, the car in front of her, when he saw the caution of the light turn yellow, he stopped. Amanda is I won't say she's a good driver, but she somehow manages to get from point A to point B in that. And she'd been telling her, teaching her, the triplets, what the caution lights meant. And so we had the triplets going somewhere one day and come up to a caution light, and Austin said, the light's turning yellow. I said, yeah. I said, you know what the lights mean? He said, yeah. I said, what does the green light mean? He said, green light means you can go. I said, what does the red light mean? He said, the red light means you're supposed to stop. I said, what does that yellow light mean? He said, that yellow light means you're supposed to go fast. But the lady came up to the yellow light. I'm sorry, I was just using Amanda as an illustration there, but you do get the point. The lady came up and the person in front of her stopped. And she laid on her horn and she mouthed all kinds of things, telling this person in the car that he did what he was supposed to do. But she's telling him all about how, what a terrible thing he did, and she's just really giving him what for. And she heard a knock on her window. And she looked up and there was a state trooper there. Roll your window down. She rolled the window down and said, you all know the procedure. I'm not the only one in here that's ever been stopped by a traffic cop. I know. The first thing they want to know is, do you know why I stopped you? Well, yes, I have a pretty good idea, but I'm not going to tell you. You figure out yourself. But she rolled the window down and he said, I need to see your title, registration, and all this. So she handed it to him. And now she's really fuming. She is really mad because now she's going to be later to work than ever because of that guy in front of her, right? No, not really. But the cop goes back to his car and he runs some things through, and he came up and he handed her papers back and he said, well, I suppose you're free to go now. She said, why did you stop me? He said, well, I followed you for a little ways. And I saw a bumper sticker on your car that said, honk if you love Jesus. Ain't that so sweet? And he said, I saw this little sign in your back windshield that said, follow me to Sunday school. And he said, and I saw that little Christian fish symbol on the back of your trunk. So when I saw all those things, it indicated to me that you were a Christian. And then, when I heard you slam on your brakes, lay on your horn, saw the words that you were mouthing to this gentleman in front of you, and saw all the obscene gestures that you were making to him, I naturally thought the car had been stolen. That is a humorous way of saying, I guess, that people are watching our lives. Now the good thing, remember we started out this message by talking about restoring the joy in our lives. Did you know that if the enemy can take away, I'm going to rephrase that in a minute, but just for a second, if Satan can take away the joy that's in your life, he knows that taking salvation is just a short matter of time. First thing, we all know that we're in this life, this human physical state for just a relatively short time. And so, if there's no joy in it, what's the point, right? So he knows if he can take the joy from our life, then the salvation, most people will just, well, there's no joy in it anymore. I'll just lay it aside. Now, here's the key. Satan, and you can write this down in your notebooks if you want to. I'm going to be so bold as to say Satan cannot take your joy. Here's what he can do. He can prod you to the point that you will lay down your joy. He didn't take David's joy. David laid that joy aside in one of something else. And especially since this thing that we call the pandemic has been raging and going on, there's so many of God's people, and I'm not questioning that they're Christians, but there's so many of God's people that I know, and I can talk to them. I can talk to people, Brother Clifford, that I talked to 5 years ago, and start talking to them. You probably experienced this too, Jeff. You start talking to them, and the talk that they had, and the joy that they had in their life then, and you can almost sense that that joy is starting to diminish somewhat. Oh, they still go to church every Sunday. They still fill the church when it's time to go to church. But a lot of them are just simply going through the motions. Man, I hope none of you all ain't getting mad at me for preaching to you like this, because this is what God said to do, and God knows a lot more about what you need than I do. God knows a lot more about what I need than I do. But I'm fearing that a lot of people through this pandemic have started to develop cat eyes. It's not so much anymore that they want to shun the darkness. It's getting to the point that they can see a little bit better in the darkness. You know, I did some research. I've always been a curious type of individual. And I started wondering one day, how is it or why is it that cats are able to see in the dark? And I'm glad that we've got Google now instead of Britannica or anything like that, because it's so much easier to put a question in. And man, that Google, I don't know who he is or where he comes from, but he is one sharp cookie. But what I learned was that doctors of veterinary science and whatnot have done studies, and they have determined, don't ask me to prove this, I'm just a dumb hillbilly, I'm just going by what the experts are saying in this matter. They have learned that cats have the capacity or have the ability to change or to alter the amount of light that hits their retina, and that's how they can see in the dark. They change the amount of light that comes onto the retina. In a sense, if Christians aren't very careful, we run a risk of doing the very same thing. We run a risk of altering how much of God's light we actually allow to infiltrate into us, to show us what we really need to see in the harsh light of day. And what happens is, seems like things that we knew were taboo, so to speak, years ago, and seems like they're being more accepted now by mainstream society. Not only are they being more accepted, they're being embraced. They are being welcomed and they're being loved. The world, I do believe, has started developing cat eyes. And it all starts with little bitty stuff. I remember, and I think I used this same illustration when we were up at the conference, but back years ago, some of the most popular TV programs, and here's what happened. When I was just a child, we didn't have TV, which worked out well because we didn't have electricity either. But my sister, who lived just down this holler and up the other part of the other holler, she married up. She married a guy that actually worked in the mines, and they had, as far as we were concerned, they had money. Anyway, she actually had a TV. And me and Daddy would walk out there every Sunday evening. And I know I asked these people this at the conference, and a lot of them didn't completely understand what I was asking. But on Sunday evenings, you may remember there was a show that came on, and the way that it started out is, we live in a carousel of color. You all don't remember, do you? Y'all remember Walt Disney World on Sunday evenings? And right after Walt Disney was Bonanza. None of those TV shows that I can remember ever had the first dirty word in them. You can't sit and watch common cable or network TV anymore without being bombarded. But anyway, what happened was this. Daddy would sit until Bonanza went off. Then it was time to go, and he always carried a flashlight. Now, by now, it was dark. And Daddy carried a flashlight, so me and him would start walking down Main Marshall's Branch to take the right turn, the right exit, and go up Cow Holler. Daddy carried a flashlight. And as long as I was walking where that light was, I was fine. I could see where I was going. And I knew where the obstacles were. And time again, Daddy has had to rein me in. Ernest, you're getting too far. Get back in here. Because I wanted to run out and test the boundaries and get out. You all have walked with a flashlight before, right? You know how you got this one circle that's pretty good light. You can see everything. Then as you span out and you get farther from the center of that light, things get a little bit darker, a little bit dimmer, a little bit dimmer, and I'd fall over a rock or trip over a tree root, skin a shin, or bump a knee and scrape a knee, and Daddy would say, I told you so. And I'd come back into the light. One place, we had to go past a cemetery, and I was absolutely terrified of that cemetery. Listen how much this little 11 or 12-year-old boy typifies what goes on in a Christian's life. Number one, if we start venturing out too far away from where the real true light is, beloved, let me tell you, there's a lot of things out there that we can stumble over. And all the time, do you know what Dad's doing? Do you know what the Heavenly Father's doing? Son, child, if you keep going like that, you're going to stumble and fall. Come back in here to where the light is. Your joy is going away a little bit at a time. Come back. I've got the joy. I've got the joy I can give to. Joy, 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 joy down in my heart. I've got the joy that I can give to you, but you've got to come back in here where it's at. I've got the light, but you've got to come back here into it. And that's the way Christians are. That's the way that little 11 or 12-year-old boy or whatever I was here. But when I got close to that cemetery, I was absolutely terrified. I just knew some ghost was going to come out there and get me. I don't know what he would have done with me, but I was convinced that what was going to happen. I knew Daddy could take care of it. So the closer we go to that cemetery, the closer I can walk to the middle of that light. How many of God's children today, we seem to forget the fact, and here's another thing that I want you to hold on to. I need God as much on my very best day. When things are going perfect and there's not a cloud in the sky and everything is 75 degrees and sunny skies and everything's going perfect, I need God as much as I do when I'm down in the valley. But what happens was, and going back, and we're going to start picking up with Walt Disney and Bonanza again, it's got to the point that things started infiltrating our lives. Little actions, little words, and little things, and they started infiltrating our lives. We didn't even realize it. We didn't even pay any attention to it. Until the next thing you know, it's just almost like anything goes. Read a story. Remember the little song that we used to sing in Sunday school? Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. There's a Father up above looking down on us with love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see. And it goes on with the ears, the hands, the feet. Oh, be careful, little feet, where you go. Man, I tell you what, sometimes I really believe this, but a lot of us old-timers need to get back to that line of thinking. Be careful what we allow our eyes to see. Be careful what we... Now, you're going to see some things regardless, or be careful what we allow our ears to hear. Again, you're going to hear some language that you don't really care about. But we can control what we intentionally allow to go on. And here's what happened. There was a story about an old farmer whose teenage children came up to him one time, and they wanted his permission to go to a party. He said, I can't allow you to do that. We live Christian lives, and things will be going on at that party. Now, I am not saying that you shouldn't allow your children, grandchildren, or whatever to attend certain social gatherings. I think it's good for them. Some of them. Just be careful, little eyes. Be careful, little ears, little feet, little hands. But they came up and they wanted to go to the party. And he said, I can't let you do that. Well, you know how kids are. They were insistent, you know, and they badgered him and they stayed on to him and stayed on to him. And he finally said, well, let me give you some thought. Now, another thing about this old farmer was he made some of the best brownies. He was a very devout worker in his church, a lot like some of our ladies in Estill are. And he made some of the best brownies that you ever put in your mouth. I mean, he was not community-wide for these good brownies that he made. So after he had thought about it a couple of days, he called the children in, and they were telling him, you know, well, that's going to be going on at the party, but that's not that bad. That's not that much. It's just, you know how children can try to be convinced. Unfortunately, God's children try to convince God a lot of times, I think. This or that's it. Yeah, but anyway, so the farmer called him in and sat him at the table. He said, well, I'll make my decision. And they said, what is your decision? He said, well, before I give you my decision, he said, I made this plate of brownies here. Y'all have a brownie. Oh, man, they love that. And they started to reach to get a brownie, and he said, there's one thing I need you to know. I put one ingredient in that batch of brownies. I used one ingredient that I've never used before. So they kind of wondered now. He said, before you take a bite of that, you may need to know what that ingredient is. Well, Dad, tell us what it was. He said, well, when I mixed up the batter, I went out to the horse stall, and I showed up just a little bit of manure stirred into the batter. Dad, we can't eat that. Oh, it's just a little bit. Well, Dad, just a little bit's too much. He said, yes, a little bit's too much for the party, too. I remember Jesus using the phrase, using the expression that just a little leaven at the whole box, a whole lump. So again, be careful, little eyes, what you say. Now, when things start developing in our lives, I had no intention that I would be up here this long. I don't apologize. But when things start to develop in our lives, when things start to rob us of our joy, when things start to cause us to perhaps develop cat eyes, right then is the time to stop. You remember the expression, it's the little foxes that come in and spoil the vines? You know what happens to little foxes? They grow into big foxes. The only way to stop that little fox from growing into the big foxes is to kill them while they're still small. Now, If anybody in here is a member of Peter, let me assure you, killing these little foxes to keep them from becoming big foxes is simply metaphorically speaking. No fox was hurt or injured in the preparation or the delivery of this sermon. But when little things start developing in your lives, we need to stop them then, because if left unchecked and left to run rampant, it will consume your soul. It will totally eliminate the joy. Oh, you'll still go to church, and you can still go to church, and you can still, maybe you can get up and sing with the choir. I don't know. But you can still go to church and go through all the motions and still not have the joy that you used to have. Still be somewhat stumbling around in the dark. But you know the good thing, God is standing there waiting for the wayward child to come home. God is still waiting. If there are little incidents in your life that you're struggling with, God is still waiting for you to bring it to the altar. Tell it to Jesus. Come on. Nobody else has to know what the issue is in your life. Tell it to Jesus alone. And here's the issue. Jesus already knows what that issue is. I'm going to go back just a few years now, and we were talking a while ago. I've never been one to dwell a great deal in the past, but I know that a lot of things in the past were good, a lot of things were not so good. But Jeff mentioned it in Sunday school this morning. It's been a long time. Used to, we'd go to church and we'd hear half a dozen people in the house that wanted to get up and give their testimony. They wanted to stand up and brag on God. Sometimes the services would go a lot longer than they do now. That's okay. When God's children are moving, and God's Spirit tells them to move and stand and saying, I just want to thank God for this or that happened in my life. Man, some of the best messages, some of the best meetings I've ever been in. The preacher didn't even get behind the pulpit except to open the service and to close the service, because by the time the service was done, almost everybody in the house had testified. I thought, man, that's God, please God. The testimonies of this congregation that please God are a lot more than the message that I could deliver. We used to have that. I remember a time, and this is one of the things that really disturbs me somewhat. There was a time, and it's not been that long ago, I remember when we stood, we had prayer requests, and when the preacher said, let's all come around to the altar and pray, you had to get up there quickly, or you found yourself being pushed back that way, because this whole area be full of people calling out to God. What's happened? Have we as a church, have we developed canonized? Have we? I'm not accusing you. Somebody said, you're trying to make me feel guilty. No, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty by any means. That's God. Only God has the authority to do that. I have enough trouble keeping my own relationship with God where it needs to be. So I'm certainly not trying to make you feel guilty. I can promise you that. The only thing I'm telling you is, if you're in a state where you find yourself lapsing into that spiritual darkness, what I'm trying to tell you is the light is still there. Always has been, always will be, until God comes and takes the church back out. But if you've got struggling with spiritual darkness in your life, there's no better time than today, there's no better moment than right now to bring it to the altar. Church, will you stand? To bring it to the altar.